I'm very excited to talk about this Neolithic era. A lot of people will say that this community in general is pre-pottery. However, they do have pottery later. So in some ways, it is a great thing to study because it demonstrates the transition from the Neolithic pre-pottery era of nomadic existence and pre-agriculture to a full-blown urban community with a lot of agriculture. Now, mainly, when I had teachers teaching this, they mispronounced it, and I do too. The mispronunciation is Çatalhöyük. If you don't want to offend Turkish people, you'll try to say Çatalhöyük. I am probably going to mispronounce it or make a slip during this video, so forgive me. The name in Turkey literally means a fork or a split, and that's probably having to do with a river or a road, and the Karsamba River. And Höyük is the Turkish word for tell or mound, and a mound or a tell are a good way to tell where there's a site, because usually there's a heaping landmass where people have lived for millennia and they kept building on that same site, and that's true about Çatalhöyük. Some of the interesting and exciting things about studying Çatalhöyük is that not only does it represent a shift in terms of how human beings went from a hunting and gathering and pre-agricultural civilization like we saw in Göbekli Tepe and also Jericho, but also the beginnings of some really interesting changes and innovations in terms of art history and archaeological history. The first thing is that it was mainly excavated in the 1950s and 1960s by a guy named Mellart, and then in the last 30 years or so, maybe a little bit more, Ian Hodder was one of the guys who was excavating it from Stanford. And one of the innovations that Hodder and some other archaeologists and neurobiologists came up with was the question, especially presented by Göbekli Tepe, why we transitioned from being hunting and gathering groups into building massive settlements and getting into urban communities. And the short answer on that is that the way our brains are constructed, we get pleasure from gathering together in groups. We literally get chemicals like oxytocin and dopamine and stuff like that released when we are working in groups of more or less than 100. And that also explains one of the things that some of my professors and also some people who do documentaries about Çatalhöyük have talked about, is that they threw their garbage in between a lot of the buildings and didn't carry their garbage out of the community. So it was really kind of smelly there. And then the other thing is, people are actually healthier when they live a nomadic existence and live longer, and they catch less diseases. However, we chose to get together in groups, and that shortened our lifespan. Now, I don't think that they understood that that's what was happening. They probably didn't have a real comparison to it, but the neurobiological component of how our brains are put together, combined with our fear of our need for defense, is a really pretty good reason why communities like Çatalhöyük sprung up. And the old explanation that we had a Neolithic revolution, we figured out agriculture and then formed cities, seems to be incorrect in terms of what scholars are thinking now. In order to understand the context of the community, I think it's a good idea to start talking about the geography and the climate. And this is so similar to Göbekli Tepe that if you watch those videos before, you'll know that they're in the Fertile Crescent. The weather is really pretty good. And the mountains that are north of the community, as well as the river, because most communities need to spring up where there's some kind of water source. So they had a really good river flowing by. They also had really good wetlands, so they were able to irrigate, and they had good rainfall. So the community lived there for 2 to 3,000 years, depending on what you look at, what the sources are. And they mainly had two sites, the East Mound and the West Mound. They're on a very good area in terms of how they're able to be kind of on a trade route, believe it or not. And they've got some really additional good resources such as obsidian and clay deposits. They didn't have a lot of wood, but they do use wood to construct their homes. So this is the environment and the geography of early Çatalhöyük and how and why human beings chose to live there. And I'm starting with a sort of export item, which is obsidian. And obsidian is going to be really important in a lot of cultures because they're pre-metal, right? So they don't have bronze, they don't have blades. And obsidian is this volcanic rock that you can chip and make some really sharp blades out of. And you can even polish it up to make mirrors. And this mirror that we're looking at in the upper right-hand corner is going to come up at the very end of this lecture, and you can literally see the person's face reflected in this mirror. However, they didn't make a lot of obsidian mirrors. They did in the Americas, especially the Mayan culture. So obsidian is so sharp that even some surgeons use it today to do operations with. It's sharper than metal. And obsidian would be the steel of the day and would have been a really good thing to trade for other kinds of items. For example, you could trade food, you could trade grains, you could trade seeds, and you could trade storage containers like pottery. So later in Çatalhöyük's life, eventually they started making pottery, especially because they needed to store grains and they needed to store food. And they made what's called low-fired pottery, and they decorated it with watered down clay that's called slip. And so we often refer to this stuff as slipware. And they did not make it on a potter's wheel. They would literally coil clay and then smooth it out to make their pottery. I want to do an overview of what the city looked like and how they used the buildings that they had and even the city planning that went on with it. So this place, this urban site with thousands of people living in it, was occupied for thousands of years. And in the beginning, they had an early area, the East Mound, which was Neolithic, and then a later phase, the early Chalcolithic. And they kept building and building and building on the same site. Now, I was taught, it doesn't come up so much when you study it now and you look up videos about it now, but the main ideas that I was taught when I was studying this was these are very much like the pueblos of the Navajo, in which they could use ladders to get up to it. And then if you had someone who was invading or bandits or something like that, you could pull the ladders up and defend yourself. I'm not actually sure how much of a threat there was from people trying to invade a city with thousands of people in it. However, we do know that they kind of built in pueblo-like pods, and they would enter their dwellings through the roof. There were no streets, and they discarded a lot of their waste in these narrow gaps a lot of times between the buildings, which has really helped us to understand an awful lot about the culture because there are material cultures left over. We also know how they lived within these dwellings, and we're going to do a deeper dive into that in a little bit. And we also know that they didn't live in single family units within these apartments or houses. So we're also going to study a little bit of their social organization because it's really very interesting and different from what you might imagine to other things. The buildings and the growth of Çatalhöyük are also really significant because they would keep building literally over the same foundations of an earlier house and keep building vertically. And that's why it became this incredible mound of layers and layers of communities and different eras placed on top of one another. The question often is, how did they farm? And according to Dr. Ian Hodder from Stanford, they had a farmland probably, and this is theoretical, they had farms about a mile or so, maybe even longer, away from the city itself. And people who were the farmers would go and stay on these farms while they were working on it, and then come back to live in their houses with other people. And they would have needed to transport stuff either in baskets or in some kind of clay vessels. And they also started to really develop animal herding and animal husbandry. And when we are talking about these communities, one of the things that Jared Diamond in his book Guns, Germs, and Steel talks about is the fact that Neolithic Europe and the Neolithic Near East, because of our proximity to farm animals and big farm animals that also could do labor, the development of some technologies and also the development of architectural techniques and also the resistance to disease was really impacted by this. And so people in early Neolithic communities, because of their proximity to farm animals, caught things like smallpox and chickenpox and stuff like that and developed a resistance to it. And that also explains an awful lot why when the conquistadors came to the New World, to Mesoamerica, the diseases that preceded them, such as smallpox, killed off a lot of the resistance to invasion. Buildings themselves are structurally just using a post and lintel system and are going to be very similar to the buildings that we saw at Jericho. I think that they used a little bit more wood than they did at Jericho because they were a little bit closer to more wood, but they didn't have a lot. And that's also going to be something that's going to impact later cultures like the Mesopotamian culture in the historic era. So they built their structures very similarly to the structures that were built in Jericho, where they would make sun-dried mud brick. The bricks were not fired, so they were kind of an adobe system where they would mix the clay and mud with vegetable matter and sometimes with some kind of gravels and sand to buck them up or make them a little bit stronger, mold them into more or less bricks, and then put these bricks together in courses, sometimes alternating courses, and sometimes interspersed with small field stones, basically things that they would find in the surrounding area, especially in the foundations. And they would build these walls up, and then they would have posts that would sometimes run through the middle of the house to hold up the roof, and they would also have horizontal beams that would hold the roof up. And the way that they used these houses was that they would use the roofs on top as literally a place to gather and kind of I guess you would say, a kind of living room. Now, the other thing about these houses, they must have been really tough to live in because the only smoke hole they had were these holes that they used to enter in and out on a ladder, and they had a small hearth underneath them. The interior of these homes was often decorated and decorated first with layers of white limestone plaster that they got from burning either limestone gravel or limestone stones. And it would break down into parts, and then you would mix this with gravel and water, and you would basically whitewash the interiors of these structures. And then you might go in and paint them with different kinds of earth pigments such as ochres, red ochres, yellow ochres, and that kind of thing. The houses are multi-generational foundations, meaning that they would have a kind of kin or I guess you call it, it's not a familial unit, it's almost a cult or kinship unit that would be organized according to the labor and some of the things that they did as their skills, their training. And they would continue to build on these same sites. Sometimes the interior would be redecorated and reused for hundreds of years. And then eventually, as this melted, because adobe does melt, they would use the same foundations and build the same footprint or the same floor plan eventually up in the interior of these structures. Each of the homes had a grouping of people that weren't necessarily fathers and mothers and children all in one family unit. It almost seems like they were more unions and groupings of people who were organized along the lines of what their skill sets were. The floors of these homes had burials in them, and we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about how they treated the bodies, because they did some things that we might find a little strange, but I don't think that it's actually so weird or odd. And the footprint or plan of the building was you had these ladders that came down with a hearth that was directly underneath it that would allow for a lot of the smoke to get out, but it would still probably would have been really, really smoky and unpleasant to be in the interior of these structures. And they had storage rooms and storage bins set off to the sides of the main sleeping space. And I would imagine that they would also roll up whatever they were sleeping on, and they had these low benches around it. And often the floor would be either covered with straw or some sort of woven mat after it had been covered by plaster on top of mud. And the bodies that were buried underneath it were often defleshed before they were put down there, so don't worry too much about the smell of rotting people. And the roofs had these horizontal beams in them, and above the horizontal beams they would have made woven mats and then packed that with clay and mud and possibly other grasses. The burials underneath the foundations in the floors of these places is really significant, and they've done a lot of work with looking at this. And we've seen kind of similar things to this in Jericho, where they buried people underneath the floors. And Mellart and Hodder both found lots of burials, like 400 people buried underneath the floors. They found significantly less skulls, about a dozen disconnected skulls that had been plastered. But the main ideas that I think are really important in this, and Hodder talks about this in some of his talks, you can actually look him up on YouTube and listen and watch some of his talks, is that They would take the body and they would often deflesh the bodies. And sometimes, according to him, they would even pack them in very tight skins in order to make them more compact. And often they would exhume older bodies and move the skulls and move the skeletons into new burial areas, as kind of, according to him, his interpretation is that these reburials and these redeposited bodies and bones were meant to literally honor the person who had died and to create a kind of symbolic foundation for the structure. And in one of his talks, he specifically talks about how one of the skulls would have been placed underneath a major support or a major beam that held up the roof of the structure. One of the questions that I would imagine some students have, I had them too, was why didn't they just make effigies out of clay instead of plastering the skulls, instead of taking the bodies? And I don't think that what they were trying to do was make an idol or a facsimile of the person. I think they were literally trying to recreate, at least on a spiritual level, by using the leftovers of their corporal remains, their mortal remains, and incorporating them into the architecture of the house. So this wasn't art for expression, it was really art for more or less kinds of religious kinds of things. Now, that also brings to mind some of the religious aspects that are pretty much important to discussing this community and also the organization. First of all, it seems like it was a very egalitarian community and that they didn't have separate spaces set aside for religious worship or for altars. The conclusions that Mellert and especially Ian Hodder, just before 2016 or 2017 when he retired, were that there was no centralized authority in these communities, and there was not one specific centralizing religion, and that each one of the houses had different kinds of altars in them and different kinds of decorations in each one of these homes. And their organization, their living kinds of the sharing of these houses was often not really related to direct kinship, fathers and sons, and familial structures the way we think of it today. And in the beginning, when they were doing some of the research on this, they were doing it based more or less on teeth. And in 2017, when Dr. Hodder retired, there were some really great funding and some new techniques developed, and they would take the skeletons, especially the thick parts of the skulls, and they were able to do carbon-14 dating and also run DNA sequencing on these things. So they really have figured out a lot of stuff. And thanks to some of the stratigraphic recording methods and really stringent and disciplined archaeological methods that Kathleen Kenyon introduced in Jericho, they really have kept such great records, including even keeping some of the soil and gravel that they excavated and documenting what stratum and what square it came from, that they're able to really figure stuff out. So they also have figured out that it doesn't seem as if gender was really that important to them, that males and females were often on a very equal footing, and that they seem to be a much more open and fair society, I guess, a democratic society at least, than later societies that we study, especially after this in Mesopotamia, starting around 3000 BCE. So 3,000 years later, we start to become a little bit more patriarchal. The art that documents a lot of this, and of course, because there's no written record, this is prehistoric, they have had to figure out a lot of these things or it's all theory, let's put it that way, about what people did and what the decorations mean in each one of these places. Now, one of the things that Dr. Hodder has talked about in terms of an egalitarian kind of structure is that he did a statistical analysis in which he compared what we might consider to be prestige items and wealth items, and he did not find that there were significantly more wealth in any one of the houses than another. And he also did not find that the larger units had more wealth installed in them. All of these places were decorated, and the decorations are distinct and separate in a lot of the different houses. However, some iconography or symbols come up again and again, and we've seen these in the Paleolithic era, and we've seen them in the Neolithic era as well. So the first thing that I want to start with is there are a lot of bull and large animal images throughout these, and the same way that they preserve the skulls of people, they would often preserve the skulls and the horns of large bulls and aurochs and other animals, and they would install them as kind of altars and or decoration in each one of the houses. The other thing that they found, similar to some of the Paleolithic sites that we looked at, was that they had handprints on a lot of the walls. And I suppose a nice extrapolation of that would be that handprints are a way of literally showing that you were there. It's kind of marking that with a unique shape using your hand as a printing method. If we extrapolate a little further on some of these things, and we're going to look at some of the bull murals, bulls and leopards and panthers are going to be very important, and they are very powerful animals, and not all of them are animals that you eat. And we found the same thing in Göbekli Tepe. Which brings us to other kinds of decorations on some of the other walls. We're not going to have time to discuss each and every one of them, obviously, because it's a very big site. But there are vulture walls, and these sort of vulture and these kinds of scavenger bird images are in a higher frequency in some of the houses that might have been devoted to funerary techniques and that kind of thing. There are also lots of houses with leopard imagery, and in particular there are even relief sculptures made out of the limestone plaster and then painted on some of the walls that are associated with what you might call the leopard clan or the leopard community in some ways. And also lots of animals and animal hunts on the walls as well. And in some of the paintings, you'll see things that are similar to the image of the bird-headed person next to the bison with its entrails hanging out next to the staff that we looked at from Lascaux in the Paleolithic era, that these could be hunting scenes where Dr. Hodder is pretty convinced that most of these things are kind of almost like bullfights or rodeos or counting coup. And so you'll see a lot of that. And that the big animals, such as leopards and large cats, we're going to see that happen in much later cultures, and they are often emblems of some sort of hunting power and hunting prowess. So a lot of this is related to specific jobs. I think it's important to talk about these leopard images because they're a little different than some of the other flat two-dimensional wall paintings we'll be looking at. And so I want to talk about them in terms of a formal analysis. First of all, they are almost lifelike. However, there's a nice combination of some things in which they are stylizing things and making diagrammatic representations of these leopards, including the patterns on their bodies. The sizes are pretty naturalistic because they are very near the scale of actual leopards. And they are placed they are placed as sculptural friezes on the walls that have been what are called polychromed. Poly means many, chroma is color, so they've been painted. Probably too much is made out of interpreting the poses, but what I do want to say is the way in which they're depicting them is consistent with what we saw in Paleolithic art, in which the profile view of an animal is much easier and much more diagrammatic and clear about what you would be seeing. The other thing that we're seeing, and we're going to see repeated in almost all of the imagery, is that they are not creating too much of an environment behind them. So there is no what we call a foreground, where things are up against the front of the picture, and then a middle ground where things are kind of in between, and then a background which might be mountains or trees or something like that. It seems like everything is just a flat, almost diagram. And this is going to be a significant thing in terms of interpreting one of the most enigmatic frescoes or paintings. So in general, these paintings and these plaster things on the walls, you could call them fresco, but they're not what we'll later on study in the Greek and Roman cultures as buon fresco. They didn't paint on wet plaster. They would come and they would make these sculptures and then paint on them with dry, once the plaster was dry, often using either animal fat or some kind of eggs to make a binder or a glue that would hold the pigments to it. The interpretation of the leopard relief frescoes is probably too much based on our point of view. So I want to be careful about really accepting a lot of these interpretations, because I think we can't stand not knowing. So we make up meaning and we try to figure these things out. But it does seem reasonable that the leopard houses might have been connected to hunting traditions. And I think that's the most important thing. And then the second thing is leopards and big cats are dangerous. And we find in later cultures in Mesopotamia and Egypt, there are a lot of hunting scenes in which people, especially royalty, are hunting big cats to show that they are good warriors. So I think that we can kind of extrapolate backwards to that kind of thing and at least say that these things are symbols of some sort of physical prowess, either in hunting or in battle. And a lot of the paintings on the walls really have a lot to do with hunting, because you'll have an animal in the center and you will have them surrounded by groups of human beings, often carrying spears and doing things that look like they're hunting them, or at least harassing the animal. And Dr. Hodder actually talks about this in some of his talks. The first thing that I want to do is talk a little bit about the way or the condition in which these things were found, and the images that you'll see, which are recreations or simulations of the interior of these things in some of the museums in Turkey. So when they are named, they will often be called shrines by later archaeologists and anthropologists. But I think that might also be, again, we're taking our point of view and laying it on top of this. So these are from Shrine 5 that was reproduced in a Turkish museum. But on the right-hand side, we see how hard it would be for us excavating these things and finding them in their original conditions to decipher and to think about how they were painted, because that white plaster would have been stained. And then the other thing is that each one of these walls, sometimes the interior has layers and layers and layers of plaster with different kinds of paintings on each one of the walls. And often it's hard to separate the layers and figure out the chronology based on that. So Dr. Hodder specifically talks about, for example, these humans who are surrounding this auroch or bull, and the fact that they are kind of hunting him or counting coup, meaning that there are some communities that you show your mastery over either your animal nature or over animals in general by doing sort of almost acrobatic moves. We have this in a community that is around 1500 BCE that is on the island of Crete called Knossos, in which they have these frescoes that show people running towards the front of the bull and vaulting over the back, and they're called bull leaping frescoes. And we see a similar thing to that all the way back from 6 or 7,000 BCE with this fresco that we're looking at. The image on the right is a reproduction or a simulation of the fresco on the left-hand side, and the image that we see here is the original and the interpretation and simulation of it. Now, one of the things that I want to point out is in all of the images that we looked at before, there is no background behind the animals. And often, even though there is a bit of scale difference between the human forms and the animal forms, that might be a representation of how powerful they are. So they're not meant to create a background that the humans are smaller than the people, than the animal in a foreground. It's just that the animal is that much bigger, and they are both on the same level, on the same place in space. I'm bringing that up because of this particularly enigmatic or mysterious fresco that's on one of the walls. And I want to talk about it in terms of all the different interpretations of this, because we're seeing here a reproduction of it in one of the museums in Turkey. And it includes the animal skins and the bull heads that have been placed on the walls, and you can see the interior of this structure. And when they first discovered it in the 1960s in Building 14, they did try to interpret or figure out what this thing was. I have a chart or diagram of the various interpretations of it in this grid below the image. And when I was taught this by my professor, Herbert Broderick at Lehman College, way back in the late 80s, what he described it as, because this is what James Mellert said it was, is that the bottom band that we see is a representation of the actual community, almost like a floor plan of the city. And that orange or red ochre form behind it is a representation of the mountains. Since that point in time, especially just using some common sense, Ian Hodder has possibly come up with maybe the most reasonable. And this is, you know how in Sherlock Holmes fiction they talk about something called Occam's razor, where the most reasonable and simplest explanation is probably the correct one. That's probably what's going on here. So what Hodder says is, this might be some kind of abstract pattern that might represent the town, and that above the town there is a mat or a representation of a leopard skin. These other things are a little less reasonable to me, that it's the memory of the eruption of the mountains that are in the back behind the community, or it's some kind of symbolic map of the cosmos. I don't think that those are as reasonable in terms of the explanations, but I did want to offer those up so that you could look at these different scholars and what they said. I want to address James Mellart's interpretation of it, because I think that he had some good ideas here, right? Arrangement or layout of the town itself, of the community. Here's a aerial view of it, and shows how the community was divided up and how the individual houses had these thick walls in between them, these shared thick walls. And then if you were to even parse this down a little bit more and see how the storage areas and spaces were around the main room, and there are also a kind of sub-rooming. We see kind of similar components of that in the black rectangles that make up what Mellart thought was a floor plan of the community. And I can see how Mellart thought that the mountains that were behind look an awful lot like the terrain of that orange shape in the background. So I just wanted to offer that up, that he wasn't nuts. He just was taking a look at it and using what he saw and interpreting it according to the things that he knew about and that he had excavated. This next part is a discussion of some sculptures that were found. And I want to begin first by saying, if you go to the museum in Turkey, they have cases full of female figurines that look very similar in terms of anatomy, in terms of the thickness of the forms, in terms of the heaviness and fat deposits on the body. This one in particular has a little bit more context, and again, I think that art historians usually choose the most mysterious and also the most suggestive pieces to talk about, and so that's why this is probably part of the art historical canon when you're talking about Çatalhöyük. And when Mellart uncovered this thing, I want to give you the context, the circumstances. He discovered it in a house in one of the apartments or units. It was missing its head. Also, one of the leopards was missing its head and parts of its body, and parts of its feet had been flaked off or ground down. The context in which it was found inside one of the storage bins, and the bin had been sealed with fine silt and then plaster, so that limestone plaster. And they would have done this, at least in terms of how much they know about the community, to preserve grain for a later time, because remember, they have rodents and they have all kinds of animals that will try to even get in to these areas. So having a stone, impenetrable, hard plaster seal on it, and then taking into account the fact that we often we have lucky rabbit's foots, and we have superstitions ourselves. Even baseball players have them, of things that they think will protect them or make their game better. So that will bring us to the next thing, which is to talk about the iconography or meaning of this. We need to talk about what it looks like first in order to decipher the iconography. The head on the figure is a later addition. So they're reimagining what the head and the face and the whatever hat or hairdress is, and they added that, and you can see that it's a slightly redder and fresher color. The same thing with this animal head on the right-hand side. So we don't know if those were actually those kinds of animals. The size of it is it's kind of like the woman from Willendorf. It's only about 8 inches tall. The woman from Willendorf is 4 inches, right? So this would have been a small item that would have been at least movable and transportable, and you could have carried it easily across the rooftops and down in the ladder and so on and so forth. It's also made in fired clay. So this is, again, using the best technology they have to firm it up. And so this is a little bit like the so-called woman from Vestice, the Dolny figure. And we don't know if it was painted. In terms of its anatomy, in some ways it's very naturalistic, because you can recognize that it's a human form, a human female with thick fatty deposits across the body and very large breasts. So all of these things look pretty realistic. However, in some ways they are also a caricature where they might be exaggerated. And I think that if we were to compare the animal to the leopard fresco relief that we looked at before, the body shape is similar, so I don't think it's a far leap to think that this might be a jaguar or a leopard or some kind of animal from that area. Let's tie it all together in terms of what you might refer to it as a iconographic analysis or an analysis of the symbols. So the first thing is the comparison to the leopards means that maybe these leopards that are on the walls represent hunting and skill, but leopards are also really good hunters. And in some communities, you have heraldic lions on the fronts of buildings, libraries, and even some temples in Asia. And they are meant these big cats that look almost like dragons and things like that. And also the lions on the steps of a library serve a sort of protective purpose. And we'll also see the same thing in Mycenae, that they think that there are these lions that are flanking this column that represent the power of the community, and the column in the center, the symmetrical placement of the column, represents possibly the community that has conquered them, which is Knossos on the island of Crete. In this instance, again, we've got a symmetrical composition. Here's a woman who almost seems like she's seated on some kind of seat, which might be a bench, and she is flanked on either side by these leopards. Let's call it leopards. They think that because it was placed inside a granary or a grain deposit, and that women with large breasts and big bellies might represent a woman who had either just born a child or was about to bear a child, that it might be a kind of image of fertility. And we see this happening, lots of images like this throughout Çatalhöyük in the museum. Now, the last thing is that I think this is the least realistic one. Between her thighs is a kind of little oval type of shape, and some scholars have suggested that she might be giving birth to a child. I don't think that it's just not visible enough to really make that leap or that assumption, so I'm not really sure about this. When I first looked at this, I was trying to find where the baby was, because they were saying that it was between her thighs down by her ankles. And so I found another sculpture that had a woman holding a cat that was from Çatalhöyük, an unfired thing. And I thought, oh, maybe that triangle, that upside down triangle under her breasts is that. But I think it's too much of a leap. So I think that the safest interpretation of it is that this is a figure that was possibly representing fertility, not necessarily a mother goddess, and that the leopards were meant to also protect the harvest or whatever the grains were inside the grain storage unit. And of course, one of the things that always happens every time you have these sorts of discoveries. For example, they found tons of bodies, like 400 bodies and skeletons underneath the floors. But they only found 12 skulls and 12 plastered skulls that were coated with red ochre, which is consistent with stuff that we know from other Neolithic sites and from the Paleolithic era. But those 12 skulls out of 400 and out of the size of the site are a little bit unusual and slightly a bit of an anomaly. This thing that Dr. Hodder and his crew found in 2016 is completely unusual. And of course, because it's so unusual and it's also in such great condition, everybody wanted to talk about it. So now it becomes part of the canon of art history. So they uncovered a small stone sculpture, so it's not even made out of clay, where almost all of the sculptures were made out of low-fired clay. He found this beautifully carved sculpture that looks an awful lot like the figure from the grain storage. And it was also buried with an obsidian mirror, which is also an anomaly. It's also very unusual because they don't have that many obsidian mirrors from Çatalhöyük. So I wanted to point out the conditions that they found it in, and they found this thing really reverently buried, not in a trash pit. So that's most of the things that they found. Most of the sculptures they found in the detritus, the castaways from the community. And this seems to be buried almost in a way that's similar to some of the burials that we're going to see in the Cyclades, where they literally buried these little figurines of female figures in tombs in a way to honor whoever was buried there. But this was not found in conjunction with the body. So is it buried treasure? I don't know. And the fact that it's so unique, even in terms of the carving of it, also means some things about that. The things that I do want to point out is that, like the woman from Willendorf and these other women from the Paleolithic era, the arms and legs are engaged, they're placed against it, the face and the body are stylized, and they share a lot of the physical features of the large breasts and the heavy, large stomach, which could be depicting a pregnant female. So in closing, I just wanted to say that, Çatalhöyük is part of the canon because of how much has been found there. Really complete architectural and a historical record, complete artifacts. Recently, they've also really been able to figure out what their agriculture and farming are because the science has gotten better and they've been able to date stuff. The work seems incredibly consistent with the traditions that we see from the Paleolithic era and from Jericho, also all in the Fertile Crescent, and that the traditions of stylizing things but still portraying things that are in the natural environment and making them depicted in a way that is more diagrammatic and symbolic seems to be a common thread that runs through all of these cultures.